I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president, but I don't even talk about that.
As President Donald Trump in July of 2019 offering his take on the constitutional limits of the presidency. His take is that the limit does not exist. 5 years later, in July of this year, the Supreme Court handed down its ruling on Trump v. United States, and they sided with Trump. Presidents were deemed immune from criminal prosecution for official acts, a term the court chose not to define. Trump and the court's conservative majority were in lockstep with one another, but out of step with 2 centuries of constitutional precedent. As Justice Sotomayor wrote in her dissent, quote, "The relationship between the president and the people he serves has shifted irrevocably. In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law," end quote. And according to Project 2025, the conservative playbook for a second Trump presidency, the president should be a king, with every lever of government serving him alone. Project 2025 vows to slash the federal workforce and replace what's left of it with Trump loyalists. That's because all sorts of policy laid out in this handbook would be impossible to implement without loyalty to a president and an administration, not to the Constitution, across the government. Especially because some of its plans are so radical that pesky things like, say, expertise would simply get in the way of implementing them. On page 21, Project 2025 says, quote, "The next administration must not cede such authority to nonpartisan experts," end quote. Project 2025 plans on achieving that goal by removing protections for thousands of career civil servants, often experts in their field, and replacing them with politically loyal appointees who answer only to the president. So picture, hypothetically speaking, a scientist who studies the effects of chemicals in our water being replaced with someone who has no scientific background but a solid track record of supporting Trump's ideas. Across the 900-plus pages of Project 2025, this strategy is spoken in code. On page 552, for example, they suggest, quote, "The director of the FBI must remain politically accountable to the president," end quote. Politically accountable is code for obedient. That's what we want, an FBI that works at the whims of the president, arresting his political opponents, journalists, prosecutors, critics, even judges who don't do his bidding. Remember, one of Trump's first big scandals as president was firing FBI Director James Comey for not publicly saying Trump was not under investigation in the Russia probe, according to the Mueller report. Political appointees, Project 2025 code for our guys, are to replace civil servants at every level possible. That would leave Trump unchecked if enabled to go after his perceived enemies, which he has promised to do time and again on the campaign trail. Political appointees, a.k.a. Trump's would-be goons, are mentioned in this 922-page book 99 times. In the chapter on Homeland Security on page 136, Project 2025 suggests that when a leadership role is vacated and the next person in line is a career civil servant, they should be passed up in favor of a political appointee. On page 45, when discussing the kind of person who should run the Office of Budget and Management, Project 2025 writes, quote, "No director should be chosen who is not aggressive in wielding the tool on behalf of the president's agenda or who is unable to defend the power against attacks from Congress," end quote. Attacks from Congress should be the telltale sign here that no one involved in Project 2025 has any interest in a government of checks and balances. Congress is a co-equal branch of government, according to our Constitution, but according to Project 2025, Congress should bug off, too. In the chapter on the State Department, it's put more bluntly. Page 173 says, quote, "The main suggestion here is that as many political appointees as possible should be in place at the start of a new administration," end quote. Transforming our federal government from groups of qualified experts to unblinking yes men will mean serious breakdowns in our government's ability to serve. For example, when Americans need crucial aid from federal agencies, the difference between civil service servants and political appointees shows. Just days ago, a former policy director on the National Security Council during the Trump presidency revealed that Trump initially refused to approve disaster aid for California during its deadly 2018 wildfires. The official told Politico's E&E News, quote, "We went as far as looking up how many votes he got in those impacted areas to show him that these are people who voted for you," end quote. Trump wound up reversing his decision. The playbook makes 4 promises for the next conservative presidency. Number 2 being to, quote, dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people, end quote. So the architects of Project 2025 were overjoyed when the Supreme Court assisted them in this effort, too, by overturning the 40-year-old precedent of the Chevron doctrine, which allowed federal agencies broad ability to interpret and enforce regulations. With the administrative state left weaker than it's been in 4 decades, the time is ripe for the broad structural changes that Project 2025 is seeking. In concert with the Supreme Court's summer decisions, Project 2025 seeks to create a federal government that answers only to the president, and a president who answers to no one. Before the break, I told you about how Project 2025's plans to expand the power of the president, combined with the Supreme Court's presidential immunity decision, could result in a truly unchecked Trump administration. For more on this, I'm joined by Kim Whaley, a former United States attorney, professor of law at the University of Baltimore, and the author of Pardon, How the Pardon System Works and Why. Kim, great to see you again. Thank you for joining us today. You know, we parse Project 2025. We go topic by topic, but this is a thing that's sort of all over it, and in combination with the Supreme Court basically saying that all sorts of things are official acts and the president is not accountable for them. I worry about, this isn't it's not about abortion, it's not about the environment. It's specifically about the fact that the president can do a lot more than a constrained president as designed by the framers can do.
Right. I mean, you mentioned Justice Sotomayor saying that the court converted the presidency into that of a king. And I think it's probably accurate. When you think about a king, Ali, in common law England, the idea was it's like a triangle. And the power comes from the divine to the king, and the king can do whatever the king wants. The American revolutionaries fought a war to flip the triangle, to invert the triangle. The people are in charge and the power trickles down. So Donald Trump's statement in 2019 that he had, under Article 2, could do whatever he wants is just not true. Every branch gets their papers checked by the other 2 branches. We saw this if you've seen the Hamilton musical. But the Supreme Court, in giving the president the power to commit crimes using the official office power, right? If he pulls out his handgun, his personal handgun, maybe he can be prosecuted. But if he uses SEAL Team 6, then somehow that is immune from any review. It's that kind of power. It's the official power that has the possibility of really limiting people's liberties. That's the stuff we should really worry about. And the court just took the rug right out from underneath the American people in that.
I want to discuss Project 2025's very overt discussions about politicizing the federal workforce. They're talking about firing 50,000 people, possibly, and hiring people on the basis of what is essentially a loyalty pledge to the presidency, not to the Constitution, which is what every federal employee pledges loyalty to at the moment. What's the effect of a politicized federal workforce? We've seen examples around the world where it just doesn't work. If your fealty is to a party or to a president or a prime minister, that's not the same as having fealty to your country.
Well, I think there's 2 pieces, and a lot of people, when listening to this conversation, wonder, how is this going to affect me? But you can just Google the employment application, the loyalty test for being in a Trump administration. It's quite terrifying. In addition, ProPublica just published a piece on how there are FOIA requests being done, inundated with Freedom of Information Act requests, some of these agencies to weed out the people that are not loyal. So this is going to affect regular workers. The second piece, as you indicate, is the idea behind the agencies is that they're experts. Do you really want a politician deciding how to store plutonium for nuclear reactors? No, you want a scientist doing that. But this gets beyond just science. Think about the Federal Communications Commission. They issue licenses for broadcast journalists. Do you really want politicians deciding who gets or does not get licenses, who gets punished for their speech through that process? It's very damaging, and it'll impact every single American, which is frankly why the framers said no more kings. If they believed we just didn't have to worry about it, they wouldn't have gone to the hassle of having a revolution and creating a constitution in 1787 in Philadelphia.
We got more details from Jack Smith's case this week, and it's not directly tied to Project 2025, but knowing those details, how much damage could be done if the entire government served the president as opposed to the country and the Constitution?
Well, again, it's that idea of unlimited power. The notion that not only did the Supreme Court say you could use your military power, FBI, CIA, the IRS to investigate, spyware, all of that can be used now to commit crimes. To commit crimes. The Supreme Court acknowledged that's what they are greenlighting, but also the court said, and you can't use that evidence of the official acts in a prosecution. So this could be not only widespread crimes, but we wouldn't even know about it, Ali. So it will be, again, that it could be that triangle. The haves and the have-nots, the winners and the losers are based on arbitrary criteria, not fairness. And as much as it's impossible to achieve complete equality, the idea behind the Constitution is there are processes to ensure it's not arbitrary winners and losers based on political loyalty. My deepest concern is that Americans will feel chilled. They'll feel chilled in who they talk to, who they associate with, what they post on social media, that there'll be retaliation. And when we can't speak, Ali, we can't think freely. And that's when we really lose our humanity. Everything's on the line in November.
Kim, good to talk to you as always. Thank you for joining us. Kim Wehle is the University of Baltimore School of Law professor, author of Pardon Power, How the Pardon System Works and Why.